Now that we understand the basics of the property graph data model, let's start to explore how we can do things with DSE Graph. Managing graphs in DSE Graph is similar to working in any database. We can create graphs, list and modify graphs, and remove graphs. Note that in DSE, a single graph is associated with a key space in Apache Cassandra. Any operation or configuration that can be executed against a key space in Cassandra can also be executed against a graph. Just like with any database system, before you can begin working with a graph schema, you have to create it. Creating graphs in DSE Graph is easy. Just use the system API and use the create graph method. You have an option to check to see if a graph already exists as well. Just like with DataStax's version of Apache Cassandra, graphs created in multi-data center clusters should use the DSE database network topology strategy setting and a replication factor greater than 1. The default replication strategy for a multi-node or multi-data center graph is the network topology strategy, whereas for a single node, the replication strategy will default to simple strategy. The number of nodes will determine the default replication factor as shown in this table. It is quite straightforward to create graphs with network topology strategy and custom replication factors. Network topology strategy should be used in production. The replication specification syntax is identical to the syntax used in the CQL create keyspace statement. Here we see another way to set the replication factor for a graph. Here we see an example of setting the replication setting for a graph. We have a graph called test4, and we're setting a network topology strategy replication setting with two different data centers, DC East with a replication factor of 3 and DC West with a replication factor of 5. On this slide, we see another way to set the replication factor as well as the topology strategy. We use the option and use the set method along with the option. So here we have a graph called killer video, and we are setting the option replication config, and we're using the set to set it to network topology strategy, and we're setting the two different data centers, DC East and DC West, each with 3 and 5 for the replication factors. The describe method of the system API is very handy to see the DDL that was used to create a graph. As we'll learn in later sections of this course, one can also use the describe method on a specific graph to get the DDL that was used to create the contents of the graph. Here we see some example code where we're looking to see if a graph named killer video exists, and it does. We then use the describe method to see the DDL that was used to create the graph, and we see system.graph killervideo.create was used to create this graph. To find all graphs in your DSE graph cluster, use the graphs method of the system API. You can see here on this example the difference between the describe method, which will show how each graph was created, and the graphs method, which will simply list the graphs that exist in my cluster. Removing graphs from DSE Graph is pretty straightforward. Simply use the drop method to do so. So here we're going to drop a graph named myOtherGraph by simply specifying system.graph myothergraph.drop. As you can see, there are parallels with Apache Cassandra schema management and DSE Graph's graph database management. Here we see a table showing the same syntax in both Graph using the system API and Cassandra using CQL. We're going to create a graph on the left, system.graph create, and underneath the covers, the following CQL is actually executed, create key space and create the other key space. We'll talk about these key spaces in just a second. Same parallels exist for drop. Using the system.graph.drop method is equivalent to dropping key spaces manually through CQL. Finally, and I highly recommend you do this, you can see the actual key spaces created in Cassandra when creating a graph through DSE Graph. For each graph you create using the system API, you'll see 2 key spaces in Apache Cassandra. The first contains the graph data itself, while the second, the one with the underscore system name, contains graphs metadata and schema information. Okay, it's that time again for you to put your hands on keys and exercise all that new knowledge you gain in this section of the course. Happy graphing!